They left her for dead in the dry grass of the Wyoming prairie. Flames rose behind her like red curtains pulled across the sky, devouring everything: the crops, the fence line, and the house she had built nail by nail beside a man she should never have trusted. Her name was Celia Ward, and the fire had taken everything: her land, her pride, her place in the world, but not her life. Not that. She crawled out of the smoke with scorched skin, a broken rib, and fury burning hotter than any flame they'd ever seen. That was a year ago. The townsfolk whispered about the fire. Some said it was an accident. Some said she'd died screaming in the blaze, her ranch swallowed by dry season and bad luck. No one asked too many questions, and no one knew she had survived. Until now. The stagecoach rolled into the edge of Larkspur, its wheels creaking through red dust and memory. Inside it sat a woman dressed in rough canvas trousers and a coat that didn't belong to her. Her hair was braided tight, hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her eyes, sharp sea-glass green, never stopped scanning. She didn't flinch when the coach stopped. She just stepped down, boots hitting the dirt like judgment. People barely recognized her. The girl who used to wear ribbons in her braid? Gone. The sweet wife who baked pies for harvest fairs? Dead in that fire. What stepped onto that street now was something reborn. Celia walked into the saloon like she owned it, because once she had helped build it. She passed the same cracked mirror she used to fix her lipstick in, past the same corner where her husband, Clay Sutton, once told stories with a charming smile and a hand resting on the hip of a woman who wasn't his wife. He wasn't there now, but the bartender was, and his eyes widened like he'd seen a ghost. "Miss Ward, it's just Celia now," she said. He swallowed. We thought you—" "I know what you thought." Her voice was quiet, steady. "And you let them say it." She dropped a coin on the counter. "Where's Clay?" The bartender hesitated. "He moved out east of town, took over the McAllister property, got himself a new wife." Celia nodded once. "Good. Good? Means I know where to find him." She left before the room could catch its breath. She had no intention of shooting anyone in the middle of town. Not yet. But this wasn't just about revenge. This was about what he stole. Her land, her name, her future. And maybe, just maybe, something even greater waiting where she least expected it. Because not everyone had turned their back on her. Not everyone thought she was gone. And one man, the ranch hand who had pulled her from the fire and disappeared before anyone could ask why, still carried her name in silence. She hadn't forgotten him. And he hadn't forgotten her. Not by a long shot. The prairie wind howled low as Celia rode out of Larkspur at sunset, the light painting the hills in bruised gold. The McAllister property, her property now, if justice still meant anything, lay just beyond the rise. She rode a borrowed horse, lean and quick, the same way she'd become. She didn't go there to make a scene. She went there to be seen. She stopped at the edge of the ridge overlooking the ranch. A new barn stood where her family's old smokehouse had been. A windmill spun lazily above a cattle corral that hadn't existed when she was mistress of the land. And walking across that familiar field was a man with shoulders she would have known anywhere. Levi Garrison, the last person who had looked her in the eye as the fire rose. The one who had pulled her from the back door when the roof caved in, tossed her onto his saddle, and vanished into the wild with nothing but scorched hands and a voice like gravel. And then he disappeared. Everyone said he ran, but Celia never believed that. She knew what fear looked like. And Levi hadn't feared the flames, only the people who lit them. At the bottom of the hill, Levi slowed his steps. He'd felt it before he saw her, that shift in the wind when something important is near. He turned and froze. Celia was sitting tall in the saddle, hat tilted low, braid down her back like a line of fire that hadn't been put out. For a full 10 seconds, neither of them moved. Then Levi whispered, "Well, hell." She swung down from the horse, slow and sure, boots sinking into familiar dirt. "You look worse than I remember," she said dryly. "You look like you crawled out of the earth itself." "I did." Levi dropped his gaze, voice low. "They told me you were dead." "Maybe I was," she said, "but I didn't stay that way." She followed him into the barn where the smell of hay and sweat made everything feel hauntingly familiar. He poured her a tin cup of water, handed it over without ceremony. She didn't thank him, didn't need to. Instead, she said, "Why'd you leave?" He leaned against the post, jaw tight. "I didn't leave. I was chased off. Clay had men watching the ridge. If I stayed, they'd have burned us both." "And you didn't think to tell me?" "You were barely breathing, Celia. Burned, bleeding. I carried you 10 miles on a dying horse, buried you in a sod hut with nothing but whiskey and prayer." She looked down, remembering the pain, the dark. "Why didn't you come back?" "Because you deserved to rise on your own," he said, "and because I wasn't sure the town would let you." She stared at him, and in that long silence, something shifted between them. Something heavier than anger, and older than forgiveness. A truth. He hadn't left her behind. He had carried her forward, even if it nearly broke him. Clay stole everything, she said finally. My name, my house, my land, and your fire? Levi asked. She looked at him, eyes bright. No, that's the one thing they couldn't touch. He smiled then, just barely. But it was enough. Because if Levi Garrison still knew how to smile, then there was still something worth fighting for. Celia slept in the barn that night, not because there wasn't space in the house, but because she wasn't ready to cross that threshold. The last time she'd slept under a roof that called itself home, it had tried to kill her. The loft was warm. Levi had left a wool blanket and a lamp burning low. No questions, no pressure, just quiet. She laid awake for a long time, listening to the wind push through the cracks, the horses shifting in their stalls below. The world hadn't changed much, but she had. And by morning, it was time someone in town knew it. Larkspur was slower at dawn. A few wagons clattered down the road. The blacksmith was already pounding metal to rhythm. Children chased chickens through the alley behind the general store. Celia stepped into the sheriff's office like a shadow with spurs. Sheriff Dunley looked up, dropped his pencil. Miss Ward? No, miss, no, ma'am, she said flatly. Just Celia, and I'm not here to ask for permission. The sheriff stood slowly. We thought you died. Yes, everyone keeps saying that, but I didn't, so now I'd like my life back. Dunley scratched his head. You're saying Clay Sutton. I'm saying Clay Sutton forged a deed, stole my ranch, married someone else while I was still alive, and watched me burn. That's a hell of an accusation. No, it's a hell of a truth. He opened his mouth to respond, but Celia was already dropping a folded paper on the desk. My father's original title, hidden in the root cellar. Still signed. Still dated. With my name on it. Dunley stared at it. I'm not asking you to hang him, she added. Yet, I just want him to know I'm not gone. The sheriff exhaled. You know he won't take kindly to you showing up like this. Celia's mouth curled. That's the point. By midday, the news had traveled. She didn't need a bell or a gun or a torch. Just her presence. Clay saw her first from his porch, a cup of coffee in his hand and a woman, young, blonde, glassy-eyed, at his side. He blinked once, twice, then his face drained. Celia dismounted in front of the gate and met his eyes. Hello, husband. The woman beside him gasped. Clay said nothing. Celia stepped forward, calm as moonlight. You left me to die in a fire you helped start. Then you took everything that was mine. He stiffened. That land was burning. It was lost. No, she said. You lost it. I survived it. He looked around, suddenly aware of neighbors, pausing, watching. Too far to hear words, close enough to read shame. I'm not here to shoot you, Celia said coolly. I'm here to remind you. I never needed saving. I needed truth. And now I'm taking it back. And with that, she turned her horse and rode off. Not in a fury, not in fear, but in full control. Clay Sutton had taken her land, but she had reclaimed her name. And tomorrow she'd reclaim something more, something deeper, something hers. Celia returned to Levi's ranch as the sun sank into the grasslands, the sky turning the color of blood oranges and old promises. He was sitting on the porch when she arrived, sharpening a blade with slow, practiced care. No questions, no surprise. Just that quiet, steady presence she remembered. Sheriff know you're back? He does now. And Clay? I said what I came to say. Levi looked up, his eyes catching the orange light. And what happens next? Celia swung off the saddle, brushing prairie dust from her coat. I rebuild. They stood at the fence that overlooked what used to be her land. It had changed. Different fences. Crops she hadn't planted. A different shape to the barn. But the bones were still there. And the wind still smelled like home. My father taught me that land remembers, she said, voice soft. Even when people forget. Levi nodded. So do horses and hands and quiet men with long memories. She smiled at that, just a flicker. Wasn't sure you were the remembering kind. He shrugged. You never forget someone who crawled through fire and came back stronger. They fell silent again. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, like everything unsaid had already been understood. Later that evening, over a quiet meal of beans and biscuits, Celia asked, Why did you stay out here, Levi? Alone? He chewed slowly, then said, Because I never fit in the kind of towns where Clay Suttons run the show. Neither did I. You did once. No, she said. I pretended. Big difference. He nodded, then looked at her for a long moment. You planning to stay? I'm planning to reclaim what's mine. And if he doesn't give it up? Celia's eyes went cold. Then I'll take it. Levi didn't smile. But something softened in his shoulders, like he'd been carrying that same thought a long time. Then I guess you'll need help digging post holes and setting fences. Celia looked at him. You offering? I'm not the marrying kind, he said. I'm not asking for a ring. Good, he said. Then yes, I'm offering. Outside, the moon rose and the prairie exhaled. Two people, scarred by the same fire, had finally found something the flames couldn't touch. A second chance. Not just at land. Not just at justice. But at something tender, quiet, and maybe even sacred. Belonging. The next morning brought a sky wide and clear. The kind that made the prairie feel endless. Celia stood in the fields just beyond Levi's barn, her boots pressing into familiar earth, land that once answered to her footsteps. With each sunrise, she remembered more. How the fence line curved near the west pasture, where her mother planted wildflowers that refused to die. And how her father used to say, "Land don't belong to folks. It trusts them for a while." Well, her land had been betrayed, and now it waited for her return. Levi rode with her that day, helping clear debris from the old back road that led to the burnt remains of her ranch house. The skeleton of the structure still stood, blackened timbers, rusted hinges, and a collapsed roof swallowed by weeds. It looked like death. But Celia didn't flinch. She dismounted, walked forward, and knelt near the stone hearth, one of the few things left untouched. She ran her fingers over the foundation, brushed away layers of soot, until she felt it. A gap, a hollow stone. She pulled it loose, and inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a tin box. Inside that, letters. Not just one or two, dozens. Her father's handwriting, her mother's warnings. Even one signed in Clay's hand, and another in someone else's. She scanned them fast, recognizing dates, names, threats veiled as debts. One thing was clear. Clay hadn't just stolen her land. He'd been plotting to take it long before the fire. That night, back at Levi's, she read the letters in silence. One page in particular stopped her cold. It was from her mother. "If anything ever happens, look under the hearth. Trust no man who offers charm without sweat. And if Levi Garrison's still out there, he's the one who saw your heart when no one else did." Celia stared at those words for a long time, then folded the letter slowly, and walked out to the porch where Levi was whittling a small piece of wood into a shape that might become a horse or a dream. He looked up. "You all right?" She sat beside him, holding the paper. "My mother trusted you more than anyone." Levi didn't answer right away. "Then she was smart. And you, why'd you stay away all this time?" He shrugged. "Some wounds don't need words, just time." She looked out at the horizon. "Time's up." The next day, she handed the sheriff copies of the letters. Evidence enough to challenge Clay's claims. But she didn't stop there. She rode into town on horseback, bold and unbending, and nailed a copy of her father's land title to the bulletin board in the center square, then turned and faced the people. Some stared, some whispered, some nodded. They were beginning to remember the real Celia, and she was giving them the chance to stand with her or step aside, because this time she wouldn't burn. She'd rebuild, and she wouldn't do it alone. By the end of the week, Celia had rebuilt the front steps to the charred house herself, one board at a time, each nail driven with purpose, each cut of wood chosen by hand. Levi offered help, but he didn't lead. He knew better. This wasn't about building a house. It was about reclaiming her name, and every hammer strike was louder than the lies they'd buried her under. One afternoon, as she worked on the new porch rail, a wagon rolled up the path, dust trailing behind like ghosts trying to catch her. She paused, reached instinctively for the small rifle resting against the sawhorse. But when the wagon stopped, it wasn't Clay Sutton who stepped down. It was Sadie Tripp, the town's seamstress, once her friend. Sadie held a parcel wrapped in burlap. "I heard you were back," she said, voice unsure. "I am." Sadie looked down, then offered the bundle. "These were your mother's. She gave them to me years ago. Said if anything happened, I'd know when it was time." Celia unwrapped the cloth. Inside were two dresses, faded, hand-stitched, but still strong. One had belonged to her mother. The other had once been Celia's, and tucked between the folds, a brooch she hadn't seen since the night of the fire. The one her father gave her when she turned 16. It still shone, like it had waited for her, like she had waited for this. As word spread that Celia was rebuilding, others came too. A boy she once taught to ride brought her fence wire. The widow who used to sing hymns beside her at church left sourdough bread on the fence post. One man, Clay's own ranch hand, offered to help her clear the east pasture, no charge. "I always knew something wasn't right," he muttered. "He said you were dead, but I seen how he smiled at the ashes." Celia didn't ask for more. She just nodded. Sometimes justice didn't come from courtrooms. Sometimes it came from the quiet revolt of people remembering the truth. Levi built her a front door. Didn't ask. Just showed up with sanded cedar and silent determination. "Doors swing two ways," he said as he hung it. "Keeps the wrong out and lets the right in." "You saying you're the right one?" she teased. He paused. "No," he said finally. "But I'd like the chance to prove I'm not the one who left." She didn't respond. But when he handed her the iron key, their fingers touched, and the silence said enough. That night the wind shifted. The prairie breathed deeper. The house still had no roof, no paint, no curtains. But when Celia lit the lamp in the window, it was no longer a ruin. It was a home. Not perfect, not safe yet, but hers again. And soon she'd be ready for what came next, even if it was war, even if it was love, or maybe both. Clay Sutton sat on his porch, drink in hand, staring across the fields that once were his and never truly had been. He'd built his life on smoke and forged signatures, on a story everyone believed because it was easier than facing the truth. But Celia Ward was back, and worse, she wasn't hiding. She was building. He saw the lights from her land now at night, flickering like a second sunrise, like a warning. And people were visiting her, not just strangers. His own hired hands, his neighbors, his wife. They all looked at him differently now, as if they'd finally noticed the rot beneath his boots. Celia, meanwhile, was walking through her field at dusk, fingertips brushing golden stalks that shouldn't have grown, but did. She had her mother's brooch pinned to her collar and her father's title in her pocket. But it wasn't paper or bloodlines that gave her strength. It was the wind, the land, the people returning one by one. And Levi, he never said much, but he was there. Every morning, every evening, fixing fences, mending hinges, handing her nails and sometimes coffee. Not promises, just presence. And for someone who had once been burned by false vows, that meant more than any oath ever could. Clay finally made his move one Sunday morning. He rode up on horseback, flanked by two men with hard eyes and quicker hands. Celia was loading supplies from the wagon Levi had just brought in. When she saw him, she didn't reach for her gun. She didn't even blink. She just stood tall, arms crossed. "You shouldn't be here," she said, voice calm as morning frost. "I came to offer a deal." Levi stepped beside her silently. Clay's lip curled. "So that's how it is. You lie with the help now?" Celia didn't flinch. "I don't lie," she said. "That's your trade, not mine." Clay dismounted, walked a slow circle around them. "You're making noise, Celia. Stirring folks up. They'll regret siding with a ghost." She met his gaze. "If I'm a ghost, you should be afraid, because ghosts don't forget." He took a step closer, tone hardening. "You keep pushing and someone's going to get hurt." Levi stepped forward now. Slow, deliberate. "She's not the one who'll bleed first." Clay stared at him. At her. At the fire that hadn't dimmed, but grown into something unshakable. He spat into the dirt, then turned. "This ain't over." "You're right," Celia said. "It's just beginning." As Clay rode off, the wind picked up, scattering dust behind him like ashes. Celia turned to Levi, jaw set. "I won't run. I know. I won't burn again. You won't." And for the first time since the fire, she let herself lean into him. Just for a second. Enough to know she could. Because this time, when the storm came, she wouldn't be alone. And she wouldn't fall. She would rise. The night after Clay's visit, Celia couldn't sleep. The prairie wind whispered through the newly hung windows. The roof still leaked in places, but it felt more like home now than anything she'd known in years. Still, her thoughts wouldn't settle. Clay's threat wasn't empty, and the closer she got to reclaiming what was hers, the more desperate he would become. She knew the pattern. Men like him didn't lose gracefully. They lashed out. The next morning, Levi handed her a stack of letters he'd found tucked inside a false bottom of one of her father's old toolboxes. "I almost tossed it," he admitted, "but something felt off, like it was waiting for you." Inside the bundle were receipts, notary copies, and buried beneath them all, a single envelope. Unsealed. No stamp. Her name, handwritten across the front in careful script. "Celia, when you're ready to know." Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was from her mother, but not like the others. This one was filled with names, dates, accusations, and one phrase that struck her like a lightning bolt to the ribs. Clay Sutton knew about the fire before it started. He paid the drifter. I saw the coin myself. I kept quiet, thinking he would protect us. I was wrong, I'm so sorry. The letter detailed how Clay had manipulated the town council, purchased silence, and buried paperwork. He hadn't just stolen the land, he'd orchestrated the fire that drove Celia out. And Levi. He sat beside her the whole time she read, not saying a word, not asking for one either. When she finally looked up, her eyes were steel. "He didn't just ruin our lives. He tried to erase us." "I believe you," Levi said softly. "No," she replied. "You always did, even when I didn't know who I was." That day she rode into town, not quietly, not in secret. She pinned the letter to the same board where she'd posted the land title weeks earlier. This time there were names, witnesses, dates, a mother's regret written in ink. And beneath it, Celia wrote in bold charcoal letters, "Justice doesn't come when the guilty ask forgiveness. It comes when the silenced finally speak." She didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask for allies, but one by one they came. The baker's wife who lost her brother in that same fire. The school teacher who had always suspected Clay's hold over the land registrar. Even the sheriff himself came by that afternoon. I should have looked closer, he murmured. I'll make it right. You can start by keeping him off my land. You have my word. That night, Levi walked her back home in the twilight. As the wind died down, the prairie felt still, like it was listening. She looked at him and said, I don't know what tomorrow brings. He replied, You don't need to. She paused. Then, I think I'm falling in love with this place again. Levi smiled, slow and quiet. Then stay, and let me build it with you. She didn't answer with words. She didn't need to, because she'd already decided. This time, she wasn't leaving. And no one, not fear, not Clay, not the past, was going to take it from her again. Clay Sutton didn't sleep the night Celia pinned that letter. He paced like a wolf in a trap, snarling at shadows, slamming glasses, cursing names that once bowed before him. He hadn't built his kingdom on blood and lies just to lose it to a girl with ash still in her hair. So the next morning, he rode to town with a plan. And a lawyer, the kind who didn't ask questions, only named prices. By noon, word had spread. Celia forged the title, they said. That letter wasn't real. She was never married, never owned a thing. She's just trying to ruin a good man. Celia stood by her garden gate when the sheriff brought the summons. He looked ashamed as he handed it to her. A hearing, he said softly. Town hall next week. You'll need proof. She didn't blink. I have it. But proof meant nothing if people were too afraid to believe it. And fear. Fear was Clay Sutton's favorite tool. Levi found her that night sitting on the porch steps, staring at the horizon where the land met the sky in fire-colored streaks. He sat beside her, said nothing for a while. Just let the silence settle like dust. Then he asked, You scared? She answered without turning her head. Yes, but I'm not running. He nodded once. I'll be beside you. You always are. That night, Levi rode out, alone. He didn't say where he was going, didn't leave a note, just left before dawn and vanished into the hills. Celia felt the weight of his absence, but deep down she trusted him, like she trusted the land to remember her footsteps. The day of the hearing came. Celia wore her mother's faded dress, pinned the brooch to her collar like armor. The town hall was packed. Clay sat at the front, smug behind his wall of legal men, false papers, and crooked smiles. He called her a liar, a drifter, a widow of nothing. But Celia stood tall, read her mother's letter aloud, held up the burnt corner of the old deed Levi had salvaged from the ashes. She named every man who knew what Clay had done and stayed silent. Some shifted in their seats. Some didn't look at her, but not all stayed quiet. Sadie Tripp stood, voice trembling. I saw him pay the drifter. I was too afraid to speak, but she's telling the truth. The old ranch hand, Eli, raised a hand. I seen him that night. He said we'd inherit the land, one way or another. I thought it was just drink talk. A few others followed, enough to shake the room. But then Clay's lawyer rose, waved a paper. She has no proof of marriage, no registry, no witnesses, no legal tie to the property. Celia opened her mouth, and the back doors burst open. Levi walked in, dust on his coat, hat in hand. And beside him, an old preacher from 2 counties over, one who had married Celia and her late husband under the open sky years ago. He held the registry book, signed, dated, witnessed, sealed. The room fell silent. Even Clay paled. The sheriff stood slowly, looked at Clay, then looked at Celia. You said she had nothing, he said, voice low. But turns out, she had the truth. Clay stood, furious. But as he turned, he found no one backing him. No friends, no lawyers, no town, just a door behind him and justice ahead. He left without another word. No one followed. No one clapped. But someone whispered, about time. That night, back on the land that was now officially hers, Celia stood beside Levi under the stars. You went for him, she said. I knew he'd remember. I just had to remind him. Thank you. He looked at her. No, he said. Thank you for not giving up. And in that wind-tossed silence, with justice finally behind them and a whole future ahead, she whispered the words she once feared she'd never say again. Let's build something that lasts. And Levi whispered back, we already are. Spring arrived slow and shy that year, like the land itself was holding its breath after so much storm. But once the frost gave in, wildflowers bloomed where fire had once scorched. Yellow, white, violet, colors Celia hadn't seen in a decade covered the fields like forgiveness. The old house stood stronger now. The windows no longer rattled. The porch creaked less. A new roof stretched over the walls, shaped by Levi's hands and Celia's stubborn dreams. It wasn't a mansion, but it was theirs. And more than that, it was home. The town hadn't changed overnight. Some still crossed the street when they saw her. Some still whispered Clay's name like he was coming back. But others came to her porch with pies and handshakes, fence posts and borrowed tools. They stopped calling her the girl who came back. They started calling her Miss Ward again, and then simply Celia. The children from the nearby school came to pet her horses. The widow Tripp brought seeds and stayed for tea. The old sheriff resigned, replaced by a younger man who asked Celia what fairness should look like. And once a week, Levi stood beside her as they looked out over their land, not with fear anymore, but plans. On a warm afternoon, Celia stood at the edge of the property with a wooden sign in hand. Levi came up behind her, wiping sawdust from his palms. "You sure about this?" he asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. Celia nodded. She hammered the sign into the ground with 3 solid hits. It read, "Ward and Son Ranch Est Reborn." She looked up at Levi and took his hand. "I don't want to forget what happened," she said quietly. "But I won't live under it either." He didn't say a word, just squeezed her fingers and kissed her forehead. That night, as dusk fell soft over the plains, Celia lit a small lantern by the front steps. Not for light, but for memory. A symbol for everything that burned and everything that grew back. Behind her, laughter echoed from inside. The neighbors were staying late. Children ran between the rooms. Music played on an old wind-up gramophone. And Levi was stringing lights along the porch, pausing every so often just to look at her. She watched the stars come out one by one, her heart finally still. And she whispered to the land, "You tried to take me once, but I'm still here. And now I belong."